Hey, good morning or good whatever time of the day it is where you are. It's taken me a while to get back to our series here as I'm reading through my book on the Presbyterian philosopher, Gordon H. Clark. And we come now to the third chapter titled Gordon Clark and the Formation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And as I've done in the other sessions, as I've read through other chapters, I'll be stopping along the way here as well to make comments where necessary or where appropriate. Have my trusty coffee in the morning and lots of other interesting things to talk about. Maybe I'll talk about them at the end, or maybe we'll see some live chat comments. And I never figure things out yet. I haven't scheduled these ahead of time. I never know when I'm going to do them. And finally found some time, so don't give anyone any warning. And so it's unlikely that I'll have many viewers or commenters during the video, but always glad for comments afterwards, and will do my best to respond. So, chapter 3. There's a quote first I have from Machen to Clark, and there are a few letters. There was one letter actually to Gordon Clark's father from J. Gresham Machen. And it's interesting. I don't think that probably many Machen scholars know of it because it is just in the Clark's family possession. I don't think there's a copy in any of the archives. But then there's also letters between Machen and Gordon Clark, and those are in the archives. So Machen says, 20th of August, 1936, just 6 months before, or 5 months before he passes away. For reasons which will appear as you read the document, I am enclosing a copy of a very delightful letter which I have just received from the Reverend Professor G. Engel, D.D., of the Presbyterian Theological Seminary, Pyongyang, Korea. What he says about your nominating speech in the election of moderator is certainly well deserved, so far as the speech is concerned. I know I am not worthy of that speech, and yet every time I think of it, it gives me new joy and courage. It seems that in early years of Dr. Clark's work in ministry in the church, that he was somewhat of a speech giver, in apparently pretty good at it. Early on, there's praise for it. There's never any praise later for his sermons or anything like this, but he gave a speech at the League of Evangelical Students, one point, maybe 1929, if memory serves me right. And that was well received. And then he gave the nominating speech for J. Gresham Machen as the moderator of the first General Assembly of what became the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And that's actually a footnote that you'll find in the histories that somewhat overlook Clark, or I would say mostly overlook Clark, but they will note that. To be fair, the histories overlook a lot of the figures. In my opinion, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church histories have sort of a bent towards focusing on a couple guys that they've chosen to be their guys, Machen and Van Til, etc. They certainly don't give much place for the men who later left for the Bible Presbyterian Church, or really much place either for the ministers. It's all about the Westminster Seminary professors. So there's a sort of odd focus there. But when the Westminster Seminary professors write the history, you might not be surprised that it's about the Westminster Seminary professors. So we'll begin the actual text of this chapter. During the years he was a student and then a teacher at the University of Pennsylvania, Gordon Clark participated in contemporary doctrinal and organizational struggles within the Presbyterian Church. In these struggles, Clark always sided with the conservative group of his denomination and endeavored to keep the denomination true to the Westminster Confession. Like other American churches in the 1920s and 30s, the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, PCUSA, was embroiled in the fundamentalist modernist controversy. This controversy, as the name implies, was fought by men of two distinct theological persuasions, the fundamentalists and the modernists, each of whom were seeking control of the denomination. The modernist faction generally accepted Darwin's theory of evolution. They believed in the supposed progress of science to solve all social problems. In matters of religion, they were attracted to the so called higher methods of biblical criticism, which denied that the Bible was free of error and placed human experience above biblical revelation as man's ultimate authority. Modernism then threatened the unity and fidelity of the church because it provided an alternative set of explanations of the world that contradicted Christian beliefs, traditional Christian beliefs. Although modernism grew in support substantially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, its ascendance was not without resistance. The fundamentalist movement arose to combat modernism's influence in the church. The fundamentalists first appeared as a named group in 1909. In that year were published the first volumes of the Fundamentals, a series of booklets written by conservative biblical scholars to address crucial biblical topics. Fundamentalists generally held to the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, the teaching that the Bible, in its original manuscripts, is free from error. Though members of the fundamentalists came from a number of denominations, perhaps the most prominent among them was Princeton professor B.B. Warfield, under whom Clarke's father had studied. Warfield was a strong proponent of biblical inerrancy. The Clarkes, both David and Gordon alike, followed in Warfield's footsteps on this doctrine. Although there were events foreshadowing the fundamentalist modernist controversy at the turn of the 20th century, the controversy truly erupted in 1923 when, in response to the pressures of modernism's growing influence, a fundamentalist group within the PCUSA adopted a motion at the General Assembly calling for stricter requirements on the ordination of pastors. These requirements, known as the Five Fundamentals, called for pastors to faithfully uphold the doctrines of the inerrancy of Scripture, Christ's substitutionary atonement for man, the historicity of the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection of Christ, and the authenticity of Christ's miracles. The fundamentalists knew that if the church were to limit ordination to only those who believed these central tenets, modernism would face an uphill struggle in the church. It would be incorrect to say, however, that the fundamentalists created the divide in the church with this stance. Rather, they recognized that the divide already existed and dug a trench to defend their historic position while clearly identifying their opponents. Though Clarke was only 21 years of age in 1923, the Presbyterian published 2 articles by him that show his position on the controversy. In the first article, What Shall We Do?, he wrote, "If the church's adherence to Christ is going to discourage young men from entering the ministry, fine. Tell prominent modernist leaders, Doctors Fosdick and McCall, that we want to discourage that type of young men." And in the second article, How Long?, Clarke wrote, "When a presbytery ordains men who deny the virgin birth, when the church with schisms is split asunder, with heresies distressed, the cry naturally goes up, 'How long, O Lord, how long?'" Clarke, without any doubt, sided with the fundamentalists. In 1924, the modernist faction within the PCUSA responded to the Five Fundamentals with their own statement, the Auburn Affirmation. The name for this document came from its association with Auburn Theological Seminary in Auburn, New York, where it was composed. The Auburn Affirmation rejected the new requirements for ordination in the PCUSA. From an initial group of 32 signatories, it grew to receive the support of over 1,300 out of approximately 10,000 PCUSA pastors nationwide. Now, as a historical note, I might add that the church that I'm pastoring now, the Presbyterian Church, we technically First Presbyterian Church at Unionville, New York, which was once a PCUSA church, now by God's grace in the Bible Presbyterian Church, that back in the day we had an elder named Isaac Swift, and this is in the 19th century, and 2 of his sons became Presbyterian ministers, and both of them signed the Auburn Affirmation. I'm quite embarrassed by that, But I am up here in New York, where I think there was probably more support for these type of views, that the liberalism may have been more rampant here. And mine was actually a new school church for a time, while the neighboring Westtown church was an old school church. In fact, on a recent map I found, well, an old map that I recently found, 1851, the neighboring church in Westtown is listed as OSP. And for those who are not historians of the Presbyterian Church, it might take a while to realize that OSP stands for Old School Presbyterian. So we have this Auburn Affirmation, and here is the central message that it taught. There is no assertion in the scriptures that their writers were kept from error. The Confession of Faith does not make this assertion, and it is significant that this assertion is not to be found in the Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed or any of the great Reformation confessions. The doctrine of inerrancy, intended to enhance the authority of scriptures, in fact impairs their supreme authority for faith and life, and weakens the testimony of the church to the power of God unto salvation through Jesus Christ. Well, no. Well, let's continue. When the Auburn Affirmation first appeared in print, Clark was an undergraduate senior at the University of Pennsylvania and a ruling elder in the PCUSA. Though Clark opposed the affirmation from the moment he read it, he only attacked it in print 10 years later in an article that redubbed it the Auburn Heresy and described it as a vicious attack on the Word of God. Clark knew that the Auburn Affirmation challenged a critical doctrine of Christianity, the inerrancy of Scripture. In his view, it was absurd to argue that the doctrine of inerrancy impaired or weakened the biblical message. In fact, it was a contradiction, he thought, to say that something truly inspired by God also contained error. On this point, Clark wrote, "If the signers of the affirmation say that they believe the Bible is the Word of God, and at the same time claim that the Bible contains error, it follows, does it not, that they call God a liar, since he has spoken falsely." There is some classic Clark logic, making it as clear as possible. Ultimately, for Clark, the Auburn Affirmation was a sign that the modernists had excommunicated the Orthodox. This, he felt, necessitated action on the part of the fundamentalists to recover the orthodoxy of the church. We might look to this controversy, the fundamentalist modernist controversy of that era, and see that yes, the men did put up with things for a long time, 10, maybe 20 years or so, before Machen and crew left. It'll be interesting to see what happens in today's PCA, as different but in some ways similar problems are ongoing, and something's going to break at some point. I think this year's General Assembly will be interesting after a year off, but I'm only an outsider. I'm not in the PCA. Very happy in the Bible Presbyterian Church. In 1932, Clark added his name to the counteroffensive against modernism in the PCUSA when he joined the New Reformation Fellowship, a national organization to reform the church according to the Westminster Confession of Faith and other historic standards of the Reformed faith. Clark's father also supported the Reform movement and welcomed the Reformation Fellowship in 1934 when they held their annual meeting at his church. Soon, the younger Clark was made a member of the Reformation Fellowship's executive committee. In one document he sent out to members of the fellowship, he called out by name those who were in positions of responsibility and trust in the denomination, who had signed the Auburn Affirmation. In October of 1934, Clark joined fellow Reformation Fellowship members, Reverend H. McAllister Griffiths and Murray Forst Thompson, in filing 6 charges against 11 ministers at the Presbytery of Philadelphia, who had signed the Auburn Affirmation. The charges, written by Griffiths, declared the Auburn Affirmation to be in direct contradiction to the Westminster Confession of Faith. Since the ministers had subscribed to this confession at ordination, they were alleged to be in contempt of their vows. For this reason, Clark, Griffiths, and Thompson argued that the offenders ought to be defrocked. When the charges were dismissed at their presbytery a month later, Clark protested the decision. He argued that the charges had been illegally dismissed, as the protest vote had first passed, and only later failed on an illegal second vote when some members of the presbytery had left the meeting, thinking the matter was settled. Clark also objected to the practice of allowing the ministers under question to vote on their own cases. Ultimately, Clark's appeal failed, but he had stood on principle and displayed dedication to opposing modernism. I would just add again here at this point, we see with Clark and Machen and these others a tenacity really going after this, trying to win back the church, and even forming organizations to that end. Contrasting with this with the PCA, I am seeing some organization happening there. There's the Gospel Reformation Network, an excellent conference was put on recently, but I'm not seeing there's a lot of people, especially in large pastorates and professorships and seminary presidents, that really, in my opinion, need to stand up in a much greater way and recover or leave the PCA. But that's, again, an aside. So we'll continue. Where was I? Neither Clark, Griffiths, nor Thompson at this point were particularly powerful figures in the church. Had more prominent leaders stepped forward with similar charges, they might have stood a better chance of success. In involving himself in this case, Clark not only demonstrated his support for the fundamentalist position, but also showed he was willing to take action for the fundamentalist cause. This case was Clark's first foray into controversy, may say first of a few, if not many. I can think of offhand, probably 4, 5, 6 controversies that Clark was involved in. He summarized his views at the time by writing for the Reformation Fellowship. If our opponents say we are dividing the church, I can point to the widespread knowledge that our church is now divided. We are trying to unite it on the only enduring basis of union, Jesus Christ as revealed in the Holy Scriptures. Again, that's today. Same deal. I might add the men of the Vanguard Presbytery that left the PCA. They are, I would say they're tougher. They're realizing what's going on in the PCA. And I have mixed thoughts about that departure. It would have been nice if they would have had a larger group, but it is what it is, and give props to them for departing from error and not associating with those churches. So many now in the PCA that are embracing critical race theory and a slew of other errors. As a young church elder, Clark sought role models to guide his actions in the church. More than any other, he admired J. Gresham Machen, then professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, and the leading figure on the side of the fundamentalists. Machen was one of a few men, along with University of Pennsylvania professor William Romaine Newbold, who truly inspired Clark. Clark found Machen inspiring because Machen was a learned scholar who frequently published significant books and was also willing to stand on principle for the cause of the fundamentalists. In the earliest extant letter from Clark to Machen, October 25, 1928, Clark writes, "I regarded you, and still do, as the greatest figure and one of the greatest intellects among evangelicals today." Machen had long led the resistance against modernism within the PCUSA. His 1923 book, Christianity and Liberalism, argued forcefully that Christianity, by which he meant the fundamentalists, and liberalism, essentially identical with modernism, are not just competing factions within Christianity, but diametrically opposed religions. To combat liberalism and strengthen support for the traditional Christian interpretation, Machen contributed to the founding of Westminster Theological Seminary in 1929, the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions in 1933, and eventually in 1936, the church that became the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Machen's first major stand against modernism was at Princeton Theological Seminary in the 1920s. The various Presbyterian churches in America had for many years relied significantly on Princeton for the training of its pastors. The seminary had even been known to some as the citadel of historic Christianity. However, when in 1929 Princeton was reorganized, such that the conservatives on the board of directors lost their majority, Machen responded by founding a separate school, Westminster Theological Seminary, which ran independently on a separate site and was not connected to a denomination. Shortly thereafter, Princeton professors John Murray, Robert Dick Wilson, and Oswald T. Alice all resigned their posts and joined Machen at Westminster, where they could train ministers apart from modernist influences. Machen felt that modernism had spread into the PCUSA's overseas missions so thoroughly that it had curtailed many missionaries' ability to preach the gospel. So in 1933, Machen organized the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions, the IPBFM, with the intent of sponsoring missionaries untainted by modernism. Led by Machen, the Presbyterian Constitutional Covenant Union, the PCCU, was launched on June 27, 1935, following that year's General Assembly of the PCUSA. The PCCU, more commonly called the Covenant Union for short, succeeded the Reformation Fellowship and was formed, according to Machen, for the purpose of attempting to reform the ecclesiastical organization of the Presbyterian Church in the USA and to carry on the true witness of that church if reform proves impossible. Basically, the Covenant Union was the final stand for the fundamentalists in the PCUSA before separating to form their own church. Both Machen and Clark enthusiastically joined the organization, and Clark was elected treasurer. Clark spoke at rallies of the Covenant Union in Philadelphia and once traveled to speak for the organization in North Dakota. The lasting impact of the Covenant Union was in the newspaper it sponsored, the Presbyterian Guardian. Prior to the formation of the Presbyterian Guardian, which Machen funded, Machen was publishing his own articles on the controversy in Christianity Today, a magazine run by Samuel Craig and edited by H. McAllister Griffiths. Craig, however, came to a disagreement with Machen and Griffiths over the creation of the IBPFM. Craig felt that donors who wanted to support foreign missions should still do so through the PCUSA Board of Foreign Missions, since it was possible to earmark funds for specific non-modernist missionaries. Over this matter, Griffiths left Christianity Today and became editor of the Presbyterian Guardian, in addition to his post as General Secretary of the Covenant Union. Without Christianity Today as its mouthpiece, the PCCU needed a new press outlet, and the Presbyterian Guardian was born. The PCUSA leadership, threatened by the competition for mission funds, brought Machen and the members of the IBPFM to trial on charges of disloyalty and disobedience, resulting in their suspension from ministry. With the development of the IBPFM and the PCCU, the pieces were in place for this growing network of conservatives to prepare for and eventually split from the PCUSA. For almost a decade, they had tried for reform within the denomination, but their efforts were not generating the results they desired. And so, regardless of the fact that they were still a relatively small group, the PCCU met in June of 1936 for its first annual convention. Believing that the PCUSA had abandoned its heritage, the PCCU sought to be the true spiritual succession of the church. Machen encouraged a small group of conservatives in the PCCU, including Gordon Clark, to leave the PCUSA and to form the Presbyterian Church of America, the PCA. The new church took with it the IBPFM and the Presbyterian Guardian. The PCCU dissolved upon the founding of the new denomination. The leaders of the PCA emphasized the new church's commitment to the Westminster Confession of Faith, even rejecting the 1903 modifications to the Confession of the PCUSA and returning to the original formulation. I believe that's the original American formulation, probably the 1789, if I'm not mistaken. They didn't go back to the 1644 or whatever date you want to give. I've seen different dates for the Westminster Confession: 1644, 1646. So pick your date. Finding the new denomination to his liking, Clark became heavily involved in the PCA in its early years. At the first General Assembly in June of 1936, after giving a short speech, Clark nominated J. Gresham Machen as moderator of the assembly. As Machen was the leading figure in the church, no other candidates were put forward, and Machen's election was unopposed and successful. Clark also served as a member of the Christian Education Committee and secretary of the Home Missions and Church Extension Committee, where he worked with Machen to secure legal counsel for the many congregations in property disputes within the PCUSA. So basically, you can see that Clark held positions in all of these organizations, the ones leading up to the formation of this new denomination, and then in that denomination itself. And he was there from the beginning. Just saying that sort of in contrast to Van Til, who came into the denomination later, or in contrast really also to the other professors at Westminster, because Clark, if you as I read, was going after those modernists even in the courts of the church. Now perhaps some of the professors didn't have that option if they weren't ordained ministers, but we see really Clark's involvement in a full way here, writing against them but acting against the error in the church as well. So he's definitely not shy of, he does not shy away from controversies. Both Gordon and his father were well acquainted with Machen. Clark's father had personally known Machen since at least 1921, as evidenced by a letter he received from Machen that year. In the letter, Machen praised David for writing an exceedingly able review of a modernist's book in the Presbyterian. Displaying his approval, Machen concluded his letter saying, "I feel greatly heartened by the presence of such a true defender of the faith in the pastorate in Philadelphia." Gordon Clark was himself in correspondence with Machen by 1926, and in 1928 invited Machen to give a speech to the chapter of the League of Evangelical Students at the University of Pennsylvania. When Machen was planning the new seminary, Clark suggested to Machen that his father, David, could be hired, as he had made systematic theology his lifelong hobby and would be honored to teach the subject. So I actually have a copy of David Scott Clark's Systematic Theology. He wrote it, and it was published for some smaller colleges that he taught at, and it went through multiple editions. It was selling quite well. Let me grab it here real quick. Here we go. Systematic of, it's backwards in my computer. A syllabus of systematic theology, David S. Clark, D.D. So I recommend you go to your local bookstore and pick this up. Of course, it's somewhat rare of a book now. You could probably find a copy. I actually found a copy. Look at that, interestingly enough. Morton Smith and me. This was Morton Smith's copy that I didn't even seek out. I think maybe someone gave this to me, but it was apparently from Morton Smith's library at some point. So, David Scott Clark. Where were we? Okay. Although David never would teach at Machen's seminary, he did join the seminary's board of trustees. Gordon Clark also recommended in the same letter to Machen that Bishop Rudolph might allow Machen's ex-Princeton group, which was then seeking property, to use the facilities at Reformed Episcopal Seminary. Clark sought to help Machen's cause in every possible way. Along with his suggestions, Clark sent Machen a $25 donation for the new seminary. I'm glad I have it here in a footnote. It's kind of funny. There's a number of letters between Clark and Machen, and I summarize them. I say, in a somewhat comical episode, Machen misplaced Clark's check and then sent Clark an apologetic letter requesting that he issue or reissue a replacement check. I remember Machen says, "I've looked high and low and high and low again, and I cannot find your check anywhere. And I know how much of a burden it is to trouble you to write a new check." It was really quite fascinating with these letters. In the 1920s, they were still writing in a very formal, cordial way, praising each other, which that sort of attitude falls apart. Not between Clark and Machen or anything, but just in general. Um, Through the 20th century, I've found that the letters become less cordial, even with friends, but certainly with those who are not friends, things get a little meaner, let's say, a little nastier. Okay. Machen, for his part, saw Clark as an ally. He wrote to Clark, "We can certainly be thankful for a man like you, who is not a minister and is even a university professor, and yet is not ashamed to be called a Christian." He praised Clark, saying, "It does seem to me that God is raising up real defenders of the faith in these days. Hmm. I might, I feel mighty happy when I think of your testimony." So it's certainly true that Clark and Machen weren't as close as Machen and some of the other guys at the seminary that he's working with regularly. But to the extent that the record shows anything about Clark and Machen, it does show that they were. I mean, certainly Clark was a huge fan of Machen, and all of Machen's responses were very positive. Now, they never did get into perhaps as far as I can tell, they never did get into some of the philosophical questions, questions on presuppositionalism, things like that. So it's anachronistic, really, to say where Machen would have been. We'd all like Machen to be with us on any topic, but that's not necessarily the case. Okay. Machen's presence in Philadelphia was one reason Clark continued to teach at the University of Pennsylvania for as many years as he did. Clark wrote, "I am very fond of being near Machen, Griffiths, et al." Clark also knew the positive impact he could make for Machen's causes, as Machen had pointed out to him that the university provides a powerful sounding board whenever Clark, speak or write for the public. So Clark had had some problems there at Pennsylvania. He wasn't getting promoted. It's kind of like today with adjuncts and assistant professors, really difficult to get promoted. He was there for a long time and maybe wasn't quite getting the respect that he wanted, but he was staying there because he was, at least for one, he was helping with the cause of the Presbyterian renewal efforts. And really, Pennsylvania and Philadelphia was a real central point in Presbyterian history. So he was at an important crossroads, and if he had gotten a job somewhere else at another university, he might be less effective in those roles. And unfortunately, that's why we don't have a lot of early records of Clark or early letters, because everyone involved here lived in Philadelphia, and so they would just see each other, and they wouldn't have to write to each other. It wasn't really until Clark left for Wheaton College that the letters really pick up. Okay. Clark hoped that the new denomination would grow in numbers and gain influence. He wrote, "No doubt the start will be small, but there are rumors that before 2 years shall have elapsed, there will be an influx of congregations from an at present unexpected source." This would prove to be a pretty big failure. As far as any prediction Clark ever made or rumors that he accepted, this just didn't happen. The OPC, as we know, and the Bible Presbyterian Church remained relatively small. There wasn't an influx. I don't think they even got 1% of the PCUSA to come over. It's a pretty small group, but certainly an important group and very effective, meaningful in Presbyterian history. Shortly after the PCA was founded, the PCUSA filed a lawsuit which, among other items, argued the name Presbyterian Church of America, which has been appropriated and assumed by the defendant church, is identical in content with that of the plaintiff church, except for the words "of the United States," which have been deleted. The similarity of the name of the defendant church to that of the plaintiff church will cause, and is intended to cause, irreparable injury and loss to the plaintiff church. That's the lawsuit the PCUSA filed. Clark was listed on the lawsuit as one of the 14 defendants, along with Machen and other prominent leaders of the new church. The PCA lost the lawsuit and changed its name to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I was joking with my father-in-law, I think, who it was, who goes to an Orthodox Presbyterian church. And I said, if Presbyterian won't scare people away, Orthodox might. So you have the name Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I don't know how they came up with that one. I think that's a kind of a rough name. We quite like the name, the Bible Presbyterian Church. I've heard a lot of people are drawn to these churches as they like the name Bible. And maybe it helps temper our Presbyterian name a little bit. Although others, of course, like Reformed faith and Presbyterianism and will seek us out directly, which is fantastic. The separation of the OPC from the PCUSA was permanent and total, but it did not always produce enmity between members of the opposing bodies. Gordon Clark's father decided not to join the new church body, and he remained with Bethel Presbyterian Church in the PCUSA. The decision to stay with the PCUSA was especially common among older pastors who risked losing pensions should they leave the churches and denominations to which they had dedicated their entire careers. Although David Clark remained in the PCUSA, he was nevertheless opposed to modernism and therefore became an ally of the movement that formed the OPC, as well as a charter member of the Board of Trustees of Westminster Theological Seminary. David's opposition to modernism is shown in the last of his 3 published books, Protestant Unbelief or Rationalism Past and Present, in which he declared, the most virulent outbreak of modernism in the present century was the making and signing of the Auburn Affirmation. He further argued a logical defense of the fundamentalist position, saying this, the Affirmation declares unessential the virgin birth, miracles, the truthfulness of the Bible, the substitutionary atonement, and the resurrection of Christ. These doctrines are at the heart of the Christian system, and the signers of the Auburn Affirmation have put their names to a virtual denial of the essential features of Christianity. The Auburn Affirmation further declares, we are opposed to any attempt to elevate these 5 doctrinal statements or any one of them to the position of tests for ordination or for good standing in our church. But these doctrines were already tests for ordination since they are in the scriptures, and the scriptures are included in the ordination vows. Saying, do you believe in the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be the word of God, the only infallible rule of faith and practice? Following a long battle with cancer, David Clark passed away on February 28, 1939. He left a powerful legacy in both the church and in academia for Gordon to live up to. Gordon had taken a week's leave of absence to return to Philadelphia to be at his father's bedside. A letter of condolence sent by the session of the elders of Bethel Presbyterian Church to David Clark's family demonstrates the church's profound grief over the loss of their longtime pastor. This was a neat letter that I found in the Sangre de Cristo library. And just kind of moving. Since David had been with the church for 4 decades, the elders there were able to write this. Bethel and Dr. Clark had come to be associated in our minds as the singular rather than the plural. Now the silver cord is broken, and what remains for our own consolation and encouragement is the memory of a great soul, maybe not too well understood, who gave a lowly life for the lofty aim of knitting together a church and people in plain, ordinary surroundings, when his mental and spiritual capacity might readily have led him to seek a more prominent position. Shortly thereafter, and in his father's honor, Gordon Clark donated 150 of his father's books to the Reformed Episcopal Seminary. I actually contacted them. They didn't know any of these books. It'd been way too long. They actually weren't very friendly when I contacted them, but that's a separate story. He also investigated the possibility of having a collection of his father's sermons published, but it seems unlikely not to have been profitable enough for any of the publishers contacted to undertake the project. Let's see. couple more pages. On January 1st, 1937, 2 years prior to the death of Clark's father, Clark's ecclesiastical hero, J. Gresham Machen, died unexpectedly of pneumonia, leaving the OPC without its leader. The reins of leadership on matters of theology within the denomination then went largely by virtue of his influence to Cornelius Van Til, professor of apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary. Van Til was born in the Netherlands, migrated to the American Midwest when he was 10, and grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. After graduating from Calvin College, he attended Princeton Theological Seminary and later received a PhD from Princeton University. Following graduation, he taught at Princeton Theological Seminary and then pastored a church in Spring Lake, Michigan. With considerable effort on Machen's part in convincing him, Van Til joined the faculty of Westminster Theological Seminary soon after it was founded. This was a great victory for Machen, who desired to have more than half of his faculty come from Princeton Seminary in order to legitimately claim its lineage. When the OPC was formed, Van Til transferred his ministerial credentials from the CRC to the OPC to show his support. At the time of Machen's death, Clark and Van Til were already acquaintances. The date of their first meeting is unclear, but in 1932, Machen encouraged Clark to seek Van Til for advice on Clark's request of a suitable writing topic that would combine Christianity and Greek philosophy. That Machen in this letter referred to Van Til as Dr. Cornelius Van Til of our seminary may indicate that at that time, Van Til was not well known to Clark. Within the next few years, however, Van Til and Clark must have become well acquainted. A letter of Clark's written in 1935 on Reformation Fellowship letterhead shows that both Clark and Van Til were members of the group. At the formation of the OPC in 1936, both Clark and Van Til were present at the First General Assembly. At the Second General Assembly, also in 1936, Clark and Van Til were elected to serve together on the Christian Education Committee. And in 1937, his first year at Wheaton College, Clark even taught from Van Til's syllabi notes. He noted that his students were acutely interested in Van Til's system of apologetics, and Clark himself was anxious to clarify his own understanding of Van Til's argument. Van Til, for his part, rejoiced in serious discussion of the questions that Clark touched on in his notes, and appreciated Clark's efforts to understand first and then criticize what he had to say. Van Til was also in correspondence with Clark's father right up to the latter's death, reviewing the elder Clark's latest book. As the early OPC developed without Machen, then there was an opportunity for Clark and Van Til to take the reins together and form a constructive team in philosophical matters, if not ecclesiastical. I used the wrong spelling of reins there. It should be R-E-I-N-S. The two men looked to be on the same page regarding fundamentals, at least. Yet the differences in philosophical views between them would eventually lead to a major controversy in the church. It was this resulting Clark-Van Til controversy which brought Clark, Van Til, and their supporters into a lengthy and heated battle. Perhaps second only to the books he wrote, it is Clark's theological and philosophical stance maintained in the controversy for which he is best known today. Signs of the future discord between Clark and Van Til can be seen in 4 letters from 1937 and 1938. For example, in one letter which Clark wrote to Van Til asking for clarification regarding the definition of knowledge as used in one of Van Til's syllabi, the term Van Til used for his own books, syllabi, Clark asked, "When you say knowledge is knowledge and love, what does this second knowledge mean? Naturally, the definiendum cannot occur in the definition." So you can't say knowledge is knowledge and love. You would end in some sort of eternal feedback loop here of sorts. Knowledge is knowledge. On the response letter from Van Til, Clark penned a note in the margin which reads, "I requested a distinction between knowledge and knowledge plus love in the interest of epistemology. Van Til admitted no distinction." Clark's logical nature showed in his desire for clear definitions, but his frustration emerged from what he perceived to be Van Til's lack thereof. Now, the final section here of this chapter. The OPC was formed by a group opposed to modernism within the PCUSA. However, the conservatives who formed the OPC had substantial disagreements among themselves on many other theological topics. In the rapid formation of the new church, little emphasis was placed on these disagreements. Modernism was the first and common enemy. Yet once members of the OPC had successfully distanced themselves from that common enemy, the discrepancies in their beliefs had become readily apparent. In 1937, the disagreements in theology among members of the new church came to a head at the Third General Assembly of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. R.B. Kuyper of Westminster Theological Seminary had written an article the previous year opposing the theology of dispensationalism. Some, including Carl McIntyre, minister of Collingswood Presbyterian Church, saw the article as a critique not only of dispensationalism, to which neither he nor any other members of the OPC held, but also of premillennialism in general, to which McIntyre did hold. Many in the same group who held to premillennialism also desired that the church take a stand against alcohol. When motions on both of these topics failed at the Third General Assembly, the group led by McIntyre, along with Wheaton College President J. Oliver Buswell and Professor Alan McRae of Westminster Theological Seminary, separated from the OPC and formed the Bible Presbyterian Church, BPC. Clark was not present at the Third General Assembly, but both of these issues, premillennialism and alcohol abstinence, would greatly impact Clark's life in the coming years. At the time of the BPC's founding, Clark was teaching at Wheaton College. Yet despite President Buswell's departure to the BPC, Clark remained in the OPC. Clark did, however, have some sympathy for the views of Buswell in the BPC. Although it is not exactly clear what his eschatological views were at the time, Clark later supported premillennialism, though never of the dispensationalist variety. He also had sympathy with the movement to curtail the use of alcohol. Yet sympathy was not enough to motivate Clark to transfer his denominational allegiance. When the OPC broke from the PCUSA, it claimed to be the spiritual successor of the PCUSA and held to the Westminster Confession of Faith. The BPC, however, was truly, I might question this a little bit, but was truly a separatist movement, having broken away over far less fundamental issues. I would say that's true, and I think a lot of BPC ministers even agree that this schism, this split, was certainly not necessary, not in the sense that the departure from the PCUSA was necessary. We should not have had a split over eschatological views, eschatology, or over alcohol issues. As a member of the OPC, a church which adhered to the Westminster Confession of Faith, his preferred creed, Clark saw no need to join the separatist BPC. Further, he had pressing challenges of his own at Wheaton College toward which to direct his energies. That's sort of leading into the next chapter. As we see, Clark will have problems in Wheaton College, and that's where we see these, as I mentioned, a number of controversies. Just historically, he had the controversies there at Pennsylvania with some of the other professors, perhaps, and then with the ministers in the PCUSA, and then at Wheaton, and then, of course, the Clark-Van Til controversy, and then a number of theological issues later in his life that he would write about, some of the debates which really occurred more after his death than during his life. But that's it for that third chapter. I was thinking, I was getting confused here. It's been a while since I read a chapter. I thought we were getting to the Clark-Van Til controversy, but we have a couple more chapters yet to go. So if there are any questions for those future chapters or about the Clark-Van Til controversy, we'll try to look at those in future videos. And I'm trying to think of anything else here. Just personal updates. One of the reasons I haven't been able to read much either of this book or any other book lately is that we're hopping along, very active here with our mission to the hikers on the Appalachian Trail. You can look at our website, discoversola.com. And if you are interested in becoming a supporter, we do a gospel ministry to hikers. And if you're interested in volunteering, certainly let me know as well, as we have lots of volunteer opportunities. So I pastor this small church and operate a small mission and have a small but growing family. We have our second child due in just a few weeks, coming up in July. So it is a busy place, but it is a fun, active place, and praise the Lord for his provision through all of these various responsibilities that we have in life. I think we'll end there, and God bless.